The colony station floated in the quiet dark of space, a small outpost built from patched metal, humming engines, and the endless work of ordinary hands. Among those hands was a young mechanic named Mark. He was not a soldier, not a scientist, not one of the great minds that charted the stars. He was a worker, a fixer of broken drones, a man who could coax a stubborn engine to breathe again when others swore it was dead. His world was the hangar bay, filled with grease, tools, and the constant chatter of machines. It was here, in the middle of another long day, that he first noticed her. She sat quietly near the edge of the hangar, close enough to hear the laughter of the children, but far enough that their game did not touch her. A ball, worn smooth from play, bounced between small, eager hands. The children tossed it high, chased it across the open floor, shouted in joy when they caught it. Every now and then, one of them turned toward the girl, waving and calling for her to join. She would smile politely, her eyes shining with kindness, but she always shook her head. She looked fragile, her long limbs drawn close to her body, her skin faintly pale with a soft pattern that marked her as not human. Mark watched this exchange, while his hands worked on a drone's broken joint. He had seen aliens before. The colony was built on trade and survival, and different species came and went through its ports. But this girl was not a trader, or a pilot, or a soldier. She seemed younger, maybe close to the age of the human children who were playing, though her eyes carried a weight that made her seem older. She wore simple clothing, a plain tunic that fell across her knees, and her fingers twisted together whenever someone looked too closely at her. When the children once again shouted for her to join their game, she gave the same answer as before. Her voice was soft, carrying a tone both gentle and firm. "Sorry, I can't play ball." Mark looked up from his work, his wrench frozen in mid-turn. There was something in the way she said it, not with the sharpness of arrogance or the dullness of disinterest, but with a quiet sorrow, like someone who had wanted to say yes, but had long ago learned she could not. The ball rolled near her feet, and one of the younger boys ran to pick it up. He gave her a hopeful grin, but when she shook her head again, his smile faltered. He turned and ran back to the others without protest, yet the air held a small shadow of disappointment. The drone clattered under Mark's careless hand, and he cursed softly, realizing he had tightened the wrong screw. He shook his head, trying to focus again, but his gaze slid back toward the girl. He had fixed broken machines all his life, but sometimes, in rare moments, he could see when something else was broken, something not made of metal. That look was in her posture, in the way her shoulders curved inward as if she wanted to disappear, and in the way her eyes followed the children's game, even while she told herself not to watch. Mark wiped his hands on a rag and decided to walk over. He had never been good with silence, and he had never been the kind of man who let a puzzle pass him by. The girl lifted her head as his footsteps echoed across the hangar floor. "You don't like playing?" he asked, his tone casual, as though he were only passing by and not choosing to cross the entire bay just to talk to her. Her lips curved faintly, almost apologetically. "It's not that," she said, her voice carrying the soft lilt of her people's accent. "I can't. My body is not like yours. If I ran, if I fell, I could break." Her words were plain, delivered without self-pity, but the simplicity of them caught Mark's chest in a tight hold. He glanced at her thin arms, the delicate bones visible beneath her skin, and he understood. She was not unwilling. She was unable. The children's laughter rang again as the ball smacked against the wall, and she turned her face toward the sound with a look she tried to hide. Mark saw it anyway. It was the same look he had seen in broken workers who stood outside the hangar gates, watching ships lift into the sky while knowing they would never fly. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of a dream they could not touch. Mark crouched near her, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to play the way they do," he said. Maybe there's another way. Her eyes widened slightly, but then she gave a soft laugh. Another way to throw a ball? To run? To fall without breaking? You speak as if such things are simple. Simple? Mark shrugged, a crooked grin tugging at his lips. Not always, but possible. Sure, you just need the right tools. She tilted her head, studying him with curiosity. There was no mockery in her expression, only surprise that anyone would answer her refusal with anything other than acceptance. For a long moment, she said nothing, and in that silence, Mark realized he had already made a choice. He did not know her name yet, nor where she came from, nor why she was alone on this station. But he knew this when she said, "Sorry, I can't play ball." Something inside him had decided that maybe, just maybe, she did not have to end her story with those words. And Mark was not the kind of mechanic who gave up before even trying to fix what was broken. The hangar lights flickered as the power regulator shifted, and Mark stayed crouched near the alien girl, wiping grease from his fingers while his mind worked faster than his tongue. She had spoken those words so simply, "I can't play," yet the meaning behind them felt heavier than any broken machine he had ever lifted. He wanted to understand, not because of curiosity alone, but because her voice carried the sound of a closed door, a life already resigned to walls that others had built around her. She lowered her eyes, her hands folding together on her knees. Mark realized she was avoiding his gaze not out of rudeness but out of habit, as if she had learned long ago that looking too closely into another's eyes only brought pity or discomfort. He had seen that same gesture in old workers who had been injured on the job, people who hated the way others looked at them differently once they were broken. "What's your name?" Mark asked finally, his voice softer this time. Not the careless tone of a mechanic filling silence, but the voice of someone asking a real question. She hesitated, then answered, "Lyra." Mark repeated the name under his breath as if testing its shape. Lyra. A simple name, light on the tongue, yet carrying something quiet and strong beneath it. He nodded and leaned back on his heels. "I'm Mark. I fix things around here. Engines, drones, broken panels, whatever the station throws at me. Sometimes I fix things people say are too far gone." Lyra smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "I am not a drone, and I am not an engine. Some things cannot be fixed." Mark heard the certainty in her words, and for a moment he almost believed her. But then he remembered the way she had looked at the ball, the way her fingers had twitched as if they wanted to reach for it, even though she kept them still. He shook his head slowly. "Maybe not the way you think. But I've learned something, Lyra. A problem isn't finished just because someone says it can't be solved. Sometimes it just needs the right hands to try again." Her lips parted, and she studied him as though he were speaking a strange language. For a moment, the hangar noise filled the space between them, the hiss of hydraulics, the thrum of engines, the distant laughter of children. She finally sighed, her shoulders slumping as if letting go of a weight she had carried too long. "My people," she began quietly, "are not built for what you call play. Our bones are thin, our bodies light. We are made to move in water, not on land. Even here, with the station's gravity adjusted, I am weaker than you. If I ran after that ball, if I fell, even the smallest strike could break me. That is why I say no. It is not because I do not want to play. It is because I cannot afford to." The words poured from her like water escaping a cracked vessel. She had likely never spoken them aloud to anyone but herself. Mark listened without interrupting, his hands still, his breath steady. He did not pity her. Instead, his mind raced with images of gears, supports, frames of steel and alloy, the language he understood better than words. "So you sit and watch," he said finally, his voice even, not accusing. She gave a small nod, her eyes drifting once more toward the children who still chased the ball across the hangar floor. Her gaze was soft, longing hidden behind composure. Mark leaned back against a stack of crates, his arms crossing as though he were considering a stubborn piece of machinery. You know, I've seen drones with cracked frames still fly once you give them the right support. I've seen men with shattered legs walk again when someone built braces strong enough to carry the weight. Fragile doesn't mean hopeless, Lyra. It just means you need something different. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time her eyes did not dart away. There was surprise there, but also disbelief. You speak as if you can change what I am. My people do not alter ourselves. We accept what we are given. We adapt within our limits. It is not our way to build around weakness. Mark snorted softly, shaking his head. That sounds less like wisdom and more like giving up. Where I come from, we don't stop just because something's fragile. We build, we try. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes we break it worse. But sometimes we make something new. And when it works, it changes everything. Lyra's lips pressed together, and for a heartbeat, Mark thought she might get angry. Instead, she turned her face away, her voice almost a whisper. You make it sound so easy. It's not, he said, his tone steady. But that's the point. If it were easy, you'd already be out there with them. Silence lingered again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy with shame, but filled with the slow turning of thought. Lyra traced the edge of her tunic with her fingers, lost in whatever struggle his words had sparked. Mark did not push further. He had planted the idea, and that was enough for now. He knew from years of repairing engines that sometimes the hardest part was not tightening bolts, but convincing the machine that it could run again. When the children's game finally ended, and they drifted away, leaving the hangar quieter, Mark stood and stretched his stiff muscles. He glanced down at Lyra one last time before turning back toward his workbench. I'll see you around, he said casually, as though their talk had been no more than passing words. But as he bent over the broken drone again, his hands no longer moved with their usual ease. Instead, he began to sketch shapes in his mind. Braces that could hold, joints that could bend, supports that could move as naturally as muscle. He imagined frames light enough for her fragile bones, strong enough to carry her weight. It would not be easy. It might even be foolish. But the way she had looked at that ball, the way her voice had broken when she said she could not play, that was not something he could forget. He had fixed machines all his life, but maybe, just maybe, this time he would try to fix something far more important. And though she did not see it, when Mark glanced once more at the quiet figure sitting alone, there was already determination in his eyes. He was a mechanic after all. He was not done yet. Days passed on the colony station, and the hangar never slept. Ships came and went, drones broke down and were fixed again, tools clattered, engines roared. And among all this noise, Mark's mind kept turning on one single thought. Every time he tightened a bolt or checked a fuel line, his eyes would stray to the corner where Lyra sometimes sat, her gaze quiet and steady, yet always following the movement of the children whenever they played. She never asked, she never complained, she never reached out. But Mark could see the silent longing hidden under the calm way she held herself. He had always been stubborn, the kind of man who never left a job half finished, and the way she had said those words, "Sorry, I can't play ball," had struck him like a challenge waiting to be answered. So when the hangar grew quiet in the late hours, and the others were gone, Mark began gathering scraps. He pulled old support struts from dismantled loaders, stripped wiring from drones too broken to repair, and carefully selected light alloys that could bend without snapping. His bench grew cluttered with pieces that seemed useless to everyone else, but in his mind each piece fit into a larger picture. He was not simply building a machine. He was building a bridge between what Lyra thought she was and what she might yet become. The first night he worked until his hands ached and his eyes blurred. sketching rough lines across greasy paper, adjusting angles, erasing and redrawing. The second night he began shaping the pieces, heating them until sparks flew, hammering until his arms burned. The third night he assembled the frame, testing its joints, balancing its weight until it stood like a skeleton of silver metal on his workbench. It was not pretty and it was not polished, but it was light and strong, and he could see in its shape the promise of movement. Mark told no one, not even Lyra, for he knew she might resist if she saw too soon. He remembered the way she had said, her people did not alter themselves, that they accepted weakness as truth. But Mark was human, and humans had never been good at accepting limits. He knew he could not force her, but he also knew he could not stop himself from trying. One evening, when the station lights dimmed their night cycle, he found her again sitting near the edge of the hangar. The children had gone to their quarters, and only the hum of machinery filled the wide space. Mark walked over, carrying a small piece of the frame in his hands, turning it slowly so the light caught its polished edge. "You ever wonder," he said, sitting down beside her, "what it would feel like to run without fear of breaking?" She looked at him quickly, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but she said nothing. He held out the frame piece, a curved support joint no bigger than his hand. "I've been working on something. Not for me, for you." Lyra's brow furrowed, and she shook her head slightly. "I told you before, it is not possible. You do not understand." "My people," Mark interrupted gently, his voice steady but firm. "Maybe I don't understand everything about your people, but I do understand strength. I've seen men with broken backs stand again with the right brace. I've seen machines everyone gave up on fly again, once someone cared enough to try. Don't tell me it's impossible until you've tried." Her eyes softened, conflicted, as she studied the small piece in his hand. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the metal as if it might burn her. She seemed both drawn to it and afraid of what it represented. For a long time she said nothing, and Mark let the silence stretch, knowing pressure would only push her away. Finally she whispered, "If my people saw me wearing such a thing, they would laugh. They would call me weak." Mark chuckled quietly. "Then let them laugh. Weak is sitting on the side while life passes you by. Strong is standing up and saying, 'I want more.' You're not weak, Lyra. You're just waiting for someone to hand you the right tool." Her hands trembled slightly as she gave the piece back, her face caught between fear and a spark of something brighter. "And if it fails?" she asked. "If I fall and the frame breaks, what then?" "Then I fix it," Mark said simply. "That's what I do. I fix things. I keep trying until it works." His words carried no arrogance, only a stubborn certainty that made it impossible to argue. For the first time she looked at him not with distance, but with the smallest trace of trust, as if his belief had cracked a door inside her that had been locked for years. After that night she began to linger near his workbench more often, watching as he adjusted gears and tightened straps, though she never touched the frame herself. Mark worked openly now, showing her each step, explaining how the harness would distribute her weight, how the joints would move with her body, how the braces would shield her fragile bones from sudden shock. He spoke in simple terms, the way he would to an apprentice, and she listened quietly, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply watching with wide eyes. There were moments when doubt returned, when she would shake her head and murmur that this was foolish, that it would never work. But Mark never let the doubt stay. He would grin and answer that nothing worth doing was ever easy, and he would return to his tools with renewed energy. Slowly, the metal skeleton took shape, straps of reinforced fabric woven through the frame, joints smoothed until they moved as freely as muscle. It began to look less like a machine and more like a second skin, waiting to be worn. By the end of the week the harness was nearly complete. Mark stood back one night, sweat streaking his brow, and looked at it with pride. It was rough, imperfect, not the work of a master craftsman, but it was alive with possibility. He glanced at Lyra, who stood a few paces away, her face unreadable in the dim light. "This is it," he said softly. "The first step, not perfect, but enough to try." Lyra's gaze moved over the frame, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak but could not find the words. For the first time she did not immediately shake her head. She simply stood there, staring at what he had built, and in her eyes Mark saw the faint glimmer of hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. And in that moment he knew the hardest part was not the building, not the welding, not the endless hours of work. The hardest part was still ahead. The hardest part would be convincing her to take the leap. The colony station was never still, not even in the dim hours when most workers slept. For engines hummed in the walls, and the heartbeat of machinery carried through every corridor. Mark was at his bench again, tightening the last straps on the exo-harness, when the sirens cut through the air. The sound was sharp and urgent, a rising alarm that made the ground itself seem to tremble. He looked up, his hands freezing on the buckle, and felt his stomach sink. That alarm was not routine. Something had gone wrong. Heavy footsteps thundered through the hangar as people ran, their voices tangled with confusion and fear. Mark pushed the harness aside and rushed toward the open doors, his eyes searching for the cause. The smell of burning fuel drifted through the air, and beyond the hangar, a loader had crashed against a supply stack, its cargo spilling like a wave of heavy crates. The machine sparked with fire at its side, and workers were already trying to smother the flames, but the fire was not what caught Mark's breath. Near the fallen crates, two small human children were trapped, pinned beneath a tangle of twisted metal. The other workers shouted, pulling at the debris, but the weight was too much, the angle too awkward. The flames crept closer with every second, and the sound of the children's cries pierced through the chaos. Mark's legs carried him forward before thought caught up, but as he reached the edge of the wreck, he realized he could not do it alone. He pulled at one of the beams and felt the strain in his arms, the metal refusing to budge. He cursed it under his breath, sweat already forming on his brow. Behind him voices shouted for equipment, for more hands, but time was bleeding away, and the fire was hungry. And then he heard her, Lyra's voice, sharp with fear yet steady with decision. "Let me through." Mark turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the crowd, her eyes wide but her chin lifted. For once she was not sitting quietly, she was not turning her gaze aside. She was looking directly at the wreck, directly at the danger, and she was holding the harness. Mark realized with shock that in the rush of the alarm he had left it on his bench, unfinished but whole enough to try, and she must have taken it with her. He shook his head instantly. "Lyra, no, it's not tested, it could fail." Her hands tightened on the frame, her knuckles pale. "And if we do nothing, they will die. You built this for me, did you not? Then let it serve its purpose." There was no time to argue. The fire flared higher, licking at the fallen cargo. The children screamed again. Mark's heart pounded, torn between fear and pride, but he forced his hands to move. He rushed to her side and helped strap the harness over her body, tightening the belts, securing the joints, adjusting the frame to her fragile shape. His fingers shook as he worked, and he whispered under his breath, "Hold together, damn it, hold together." Lyra stood tall within the harness, her thin frame suddenly reinforced by steel and alloy. The metal curved along her arms and legs, giving her the appearance of someone both delicate and unbreakable at once. She took a shaky breath, then another, and nodded at Mark. Her eyes glimmered with fear, but beneath it, there was a fire he had not seen before. She stepped forward, the first stride uncertain, the second stronger, the third steady. The crowd parted in silence. watching as the alien girl who had always sat apart walked straight into the heart of danger. Mark followed close behind, ready to catch her if she stumbled, ready to fix anything that broke. The heat from the flames pressed against them, and the acrid smoke stung their eyes. But Lyra did not falter. She reached the twisted beam pinning the children and wrapped her thin hands around it. For a moment nothing happened, her fragile body straining uselessly, and Mark felt dread claw at him. But then the harness answered, its joints bending, its frame shifting, and her strength multiplied. The beam lifted inch by inch, metal groaning in protest, and the crowd gasped as Lyra held it high enough for Mark to pull the children free. The children scrambled into waiting arms, coughing but alive. Relief swept through the workers like a wave, but Lyra was not finished. She shifted her stance, moving with newfound confidence, dragging more debris away from the wreck. Each motion seemed to awaken something inside her, a rhythm of strength she had never known. Her face flushed with effort, but her eyes blazed, and for the first time she did not look fragile. She looked free. When the last child was safe, Lyra staggered back, her chest heaving with heavy breaths. The harness bore scratches and soot, but it held, every joint still strong. Mark rushed to her side, gripping her arm to steady her. Her lips curved in a trembling smile, and she whispered, "It worked." "You worked," Mark corrected, his voice rough with pride. Around them the crowd stared in awe. The girl who had always said no, the girl who had never joined the games, had just stepped into fire and saved lives. The silence broke into cheers, voices rising in gratitude and disbelief, but Lyra barely heard them. She was staring at her hands, still wrapped in the metal braces, as if seeing them for the first time. For so long she had believed she was too fragile, too weak to stand among the others. But now she had lifted what none of them could move. Now she had walked into danger and come out standing. In that moment, Lyra was no longer only the alien girl sitting apart. She was part of the station, part of the colony, part of something larger. And though fear still lingered in her chest, she knew it could no longer hold her the way it once had. Mark squeezed her shoulder, his voice steady. "This is only the beginning." And though her legs trembled inside the harness, Lyra lifted her chin and nodded, because for the first time she believed him. The fire was put out. The loader wreck cleared, and the hangar slowly returned to its steady rhythm, but the memory of what had happened did not fade. Everywhere Lyra walked on the station after that night, eyes followed her. People whispered her name with awe. Children looked at her, not with pity, but with wonder, and workers nodded their heads with respect. She had been the quiet shadow in the corner, but now she had become the girl who lifted steel and walked through fire. Yet for Lyra herself, the greatest change was not the way others looked at her, but the way she felt inside her own body. For the first time she did not shrink away from her reflection. When she touched the harness, when she tightened its straps around her frame, she no longer thought of weakness. She thought of possibility. She thought of strength. She thought of running, not just in her dreams but in reality. Mark stayed by her side through those days, adjusting the frame, improving its joints, polishing the pieces that had scraped against the fire. He spoke to her in his usual way, light with humor, steady with belief, never treating her like a miracle but like a partner in work. He would point at a joint and say it could be smoother, then hand her the tool to finish it herself. He would remind her that strength was not only in the harness, but in the will that moved it. And slowly, she began to believe it. The children were the boldest. They came to her not with fear, but with eagerness, their small voices calling her name, their hands tugging at her sleeves. They asked her to tell the story of how she had lifted the beam, and though her cheeks warmed with shyness, she found herself smiling as she spoke. They did not care about fragile bones or different skin. They only cared that she had saved them, that she had stood when others could not. One day, as the hangar buzzed with ordinary work once more, one of the children ran up holding the same ball she had always refused. He looked at her with hopeful eyes the same way he had before, but this time there was no disappointment hiding behind his smile. He simply asked, "Will you play with us now?" Lyra froze, the old habit of refusal rising like a wall, but then she felt the weight of the harness against her body, the steady support of its frame, the strength in her legs that no longer trembled. When she stood, she looked at Mark, who stood a few steps away, tools in hand, watching with a quiet grin. His eyes told her what his words had told her before, that she had a choice, that she could step forward if she wished. She turned back to the child, and instead of saying no, she bent down and held out her hands. The ball landed in her palms, warm from his grip, light against her skin. She looked at it for a long moment, her heart pounding, then lifted her gaze toward the group of waiting children. They clapped and cheered as she tossed the ball gently into the air and caught it again. Mark laughed from the side, shaking his head as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Looks like the game's on," he called. The children circled her, their laughter echoing in the hangar, and for the first time Lyra stepped into the circle instead of watching from the outside. She moved slowly at first, cautious, but with each throw and each catch her confidence grew. The harness supported her every step, and her body no longer felt like a fragile shell waiting to shatter, but like a vessel that could carry her forward. She ran a few paces, her feet striking the ground in rhythm, and when she caught the ball again, she laughed aloud, the sound clear and unbroken. It was not just play. It was freedom. The workers who passed by stopped to watch, smiling at the sight. And soon the hangar echoed with more than the hum of machines. It echoed with joy. Mark leaned against a crate, his arms folded, his grin wide, and in his eyes there was no pride in his own work but pride in hers. He had given her the tool, but she had chosen to use it. She had chosen to stand, to run, to play. When the game ended, when the children scattered to their families, and the hangar quieted again, Lyra walked back to where Mark waited. She held the ball against her chest, her cheeks still flushed, her breath still quick. She looked at him with a smile that was not small or hesitant, but bright and full. "You were right," she said softly. "About what?" Mark asked, though. He already knew that it isn't about what others think. It's about what I want, and I wanted this. She lifted the ball slightly, her eyes shining. Mark chuckled, his voice warm. "Told you. Sometimes you just need the right tools." For a moment they stood there in the quiet, the hum of the hangar wrapping around them, and Lyra felt something she had never felt before. She belonged. Not because the others allowed her, not because they pitied her, but because she had stepped forward and claimed her place. From that day onward, she no longer sat alone at the edge of the hangar. She walked, she played, she worked with the others. The harness became a part of her, not a cage but a set of wings. And whenever someone doubted or whispered about her fragility, she only had to smile and toss the ball to remind them. For Mark, it was just another repair, another machine made to work. But for Lyra, it was everything. It was the proof that limits could be broken, that weakness could become strength, that she could live not in the shadow of fear but in the light of freedom. And so the words she had once spoken, "Sorry, I can't play ball," became nothing more than a memory. Now when the children called to her, she no longer shook her head. She stepped into the game, she caught the ball, and she laughed. The mechanic had not given up, and because of that, the alien girl no longer had to give up either. Together, they had built more than a machine. They had built hope. And this time, the story was not unfinished. It had found its ending in the sound of laughter, the rhythm of footsteps, and the simple joy of a ball flying high through the hangar lights before landing safely in her hands. The end.